Well, most people facing criminal charges in Indiana can await their trials outside of jail if they have the ability to post bail. Indiana's Constitution defines bail as monetary, but a state Supreme Court rule will move away from that long-standing practice and allow counties to release some people without requiring a bail payment. The rule is already in practice as part of a pilot program in several counties and will eventually go statewide. As Barbara Brozier reports, some say it's the first step towards significant bail reform.
Gerard Barnes knows firsthand how sitting in jail for a few months can impact a person's life.
I lost my apartment, in that time period, so many things was lost. Credibility was lost, opportunities to make money were lost.
He was behind on child support when officers put him in jail and had to come up with $3,000 bail to be released. He was able to scrape together the money with the help of his brother, but says many people in Indiana don't have that ability.
How many people can come up with $3,000?
Barnes is part of the Indianapolis Congregational Action Network, which has been pushing for bail reform for years. He's applauding the Indiana Supreme Court for its work and issuing a rule last year that will lead to changes across the state.
When you deal with bail reform, then you're talking about people who are the most marginalized going to jail, not being able to make bail, and then sitting there for a week, 2 weeks, 6 months, coming out, having lost their jobs, having lost their apartments.
The new guidelines for bail in Indiana are outlined in Criminal Rule 26 and urge counties to consider someone's risk when determining their pretrial release instead of focusing on money. The goal of the rule, in part, is to eliminate the unfair and often protracted incarceration of poor people who don't have the resources to purchase a bail bond or pay a bail deposit.
So we're trying to get more information to judges to make more informed decisions at the time of pretrial release, that it doesn't just come down to if they've got the funding, so that low-level nonviolent offenders will not serve significant time pretrial before they're convicted.
Several counties across the state are already putting the rule into practice through a pilot program, including Bartholomew County.
It's not just a technical change where we change a process, we're changing a mindset.
The probation department here typically works with people after they're convicted of a crime, but is now doing pretrial risk assessments to determine whether monetary bail should be required in each case. They've even trained officers in the jail to help do some of the assessments as soon as someone comes into custody.
We have 2 staff members we've hired who will actually do another risk assessment and a report for the court. So that when the person goes to court for the very first time, the court has some information about their risk, their offense, and can make some decisions. And then we have some guidelines that helps the court and the prosecutor and the jail make all of those decisions.
The new system means someone who committed a low-level offense, doesn't pose a risk to the community, and is likely to show up for court appearances may no longer have to pay money to be released from jail before trial.
There's research to show that if you take a low-risk person, and so low risk means they're going to come to court when they're supposed to and they're not going to commit crimes when they're out during the pretrial period. If you leave a low-risk person in jail for 24 hours around other high-risk people, their risk to commit a new crime during the pretrial period goes up.
Meek says money shouldn't dictate whether somebody sits in jail. He says Criminal Rule 26 really asks counties to go back to how bail is supposed to be used.
If you look at this in the traditional sense, and so go back like to the Magna Carta, right, and look at this in the traditional sense, bail always meant release, no bail meant detain, and there's always been a presumption of release, and we've gotten away from that by letting money dictate instead of risk dictate.
But money is also why there's been some pushback about expanding the rule statewide, which is supposed to happen in 2020. Many counties use bail money to help fund their probation departments. That's the case in Monroe County, which is also part of the Criminal Rule 26 pilot. Chief Probation Officer Linda Brady says she got grant money to help with the additional costs associated with providing more pretrial services and assessments. But that money isn't guaranteed long term.
The state needs to step up with some money for this, because with pretrial you don't have the money bail, there isn't going to be the user fee collection that we're used to, and we've kind of developed in Indiana.
And some question whether the rule is necessary at all. Down in Vanderburgh County, the prosecutor says he's worried it could be applied too broadly, resulting in some people being released from jail who shouldn't be.
We run into really two types of people that should be incarcerated. People that are truly dangerous. You know, I mean, if you're hurting people, if you have a deadly weapon, if you're shooting at people, those types of things, you have a certain level of crime where somebody's really dangerous and you're concerned that they're going to hurt themselves or others. And the other is really your habitual offender. You know, I mean, if you have somebody that gets arrested on a theft, then you would expect them to bond out pretty quickly. They get arrested on their second theft, they get arrested on their third theft. By the time they get arrested on their 10th or 15th theft, you know, you've got to wonder. You've got to wonder what kind of damage is being done when you're releasing them.
He says there's already pressure to quickly move pretrial detainees out of county jails because of widespread overcrowding. So he doesn't think anyone in Vanderburgh County is behind bars simply because they can't afford bail.
It's gotten to the point where judges are taking that into consideration on their bonds. They're setting their bonds lower. When somebody's in for a week or two, they lower them even more. Just because we don't have enough physical space to house the people.
But Barnes says the Supreme Court's rule is a good first step in moving away from a monetary bail system altogether. And while it may cost counties some money up front, he says it's worth the long-term payoff.
What these counties are going to find is if they implement a positive, comprehensive criminal justice reform process, it's not going to cost them nearly as much money to put people in jail.
For Indiana News Desk, I'm Barbara Brozier.
Now, Criminal Rule 26 was originally supposed to go statewide in January, but legislators and the Supreme Court pushed that date back to 2020 so they can gather more data from the pilot programs and work out any kinks. Now, there is another group that isn't too happy about this reform, the bail industry itself. The American Bail Coalition says similar changes in other states have ended up in court.
We've seen issues with risk assessment tools around the country, not only how good are they, but questions about race and gender neutrality. Because Indiana's tool uses demographic factors, I think it's probably vulnerable to challenge.
So here to talk more about criminal justice and bail bond reform is Miriam Northcutt-Bolmert, an assistant professor of criminal justice at Indiana University. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So do you have any indication about how many people, or even just in general, who are sitting in Indiana jails right now just because they can't afford bail?
So we have really good numbers nationally about who's in jail pre-conviction, meaning they haven't been convicted of a crime, they're not waiting sentencing, and those numbers are 6 and 10. So roughly 60% of people nationally are in local and county jails who have not been convicted of any crime. So we generally assume then that they're there because they can't pay to get out of jail. I'm hard-pressed to think of a reason why you'd want to stay in jail if you could afford to get out. When you're in jail, you have higher risks of communicable diseases. You're at very high risk of losing your job. The average jail stay is about 23 to 28 days nationally. So just think about all of those things that can happen when you're away from your life for 23 to 28 days. People report losing their homes, losing access to their children, being physically and sexually assaulted in jail. All sorts of bad things happen. So I'm really hard-pressed to think that those 6 and 10 people would stay if they could afford to get out.
Is this part of a larger reform throughout the country, not just in Indiana, in terms of not posting monetary bail?
Right. So recently a few other states have looked at moving away from monetary bail. Now the Washington, D.C., not quite a state, has moved away from monetary bail since 1992. And they report 90% success rate in getting people to show up to court and not commit new offenses, which are the goals of bail in addition to protecting the presumption of innocence. So Washington, D.C. has been at it a while, but New Jersey is implementing a program, or implemented a program in January, very similar to what Indiana will have. And as of July, they reported their jails were decreased about 20%. Other states, California, Connecticut, Maryland, are all ones to keep an eye on too, who either are considering it or have recently implemented a similar program.
So do you think that Indiana can then successfully implement this Criminal Rule 26 statewide?
I don't see any reasons why it couldn't be implemented here. And just talking to a couple people, it seems like it's just a matter of policy, implementing the right policy, trying to figure out how to train people to use the risk assessment tools, making sure the funding is shifted to where it needs to be. So while the story you showed covered that it's expected to save money in the long term, there are some short-term costs, some upfront costs, and it might shift money from jails who are currently housing people to probation who need to supervise them.
All right. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.